Pam Bondi stepped into the courtroom with the kind of presence that commanded attention. Her reputation preceded her, a formidable legal mind with a history of unraveling cases with precision and skill. The gallery was packed, reporters eager to capture every moment, every nuance of the high-profile trial unfolding before them. But amid the tension, the anticipation, and the carefully measured glances exchanged across the room, there was something, or rather someone, that most people overlooked at first. The rhythmic clicking of her heels against the polished marble floor set a steady pace as she approached the defense table. Papers were neatly stacked before her, a glass of water positioned just within reach. Every movement was deliberate, every breath measured. Across from her, opposing counsel shuffled through their notes, perhaps looking for an edge, a loophole, a weak spot to exploit. But Pam Bondi was not known for leaving any vulnerabilities exposed. The judge entered, calling the court to order, and the proceedings commenced. Witnesses took the stand, their testimonies ranging from confident to hesitant. The jury listened intently, absorbing each word, weighing the credibility of every statement. The prosecution built its case with methodical precision, while the defense countered with calculated rebuttals. Throughout it all, her demeanor remained unwavering. There was an ease to her that suggested complete control, not just of the facts and evidence, but of the entire atmosphere within the courtroom. She understood the power of presence, of composure, of the smallest, seemingly inconsequential details that could shift the balance in her favor. At one point, a particularly intense exchange unfolded between the attorneys. Voices remained controlled, but the tension was palpable. A witness hesitated, their response wavering under scrutiny. The weight of the moment hung thick in the air. That's when something happened, something subtle, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. A shift in posture, a barely noticeable movement of her hand. It wasn't exaggerated, wasn't something that drew immediate attention. And yet, to those attuned to such things, it was a deliberate action with purpose behind it. The reaction wasn't immediate, but it was there. A shift in energy, a change in demeanor. It rippled through the room in a way that could be felt more than seen. Some in the gallery leaned forward slightly, as if sensing something was about to unfold. The judge, an individual known for an unwavering focus on procedure, paused ever so briefly. A glance was cast toward her, not of suspicion, but of curiosity. The next moments played out with a quiet intensity. There was a controlled stillness, the kind that precedes a revelation. The witness, who had moments before been faltering in their words, seemed to realize something had changed. Their expression shifted, uncertainty flickering across their features. Across the aisle, opposing counsel stiffened, as if realizing they had just lost control of the narrative. It wasn't spoken aloud, but it was understood by those who knew what to look for. Something unseen had shifted the course of the trial, and it had been set into motion with a single calculated gesture. The courtroom had settled into a rhythm, each side carefully laying out their arguments, questioning witnesses and presenting evidence with precision. The air was thick with anticipation, an almost tangible pressure that weighed down on everyone in the room. The stakes were high, and every individual present understood the significance of the case unfolding before them. Pam Bondi sat with the kind of composure that spoke volumes without a single word. She was no stranger to high-profile cases, no stranger to the kind of scrutiny that came with standing at the center of something bigger than any one individual. Her reputation had been built on meticulous preparation, an unwavering confidence, and an ability to see what others missed. As the prosecution continued its questioning, a key witness took the stand. The individual adjusted their posture, cleared their throat, and cast a glance around the room before speaking. Their testimony had been anticipated as a turning point, something that could either reinforce the foundation of the case or shatter it completely. The questions began, straightforward at first, easing into the deeper layers of the story. The witness answered in a measured tone, pausing when necessary, choosing their words carefully. There was nothing immediately suspicious, nothing overtly concerning. But Pam Bondi listened in a way that few others did. She wasn't just hearing the words. She was analyzing the cadence, the hesitations, the subtle inflections that betrayed the mind behind the statements. Something was off. It wasn't glaringly obvious, not to the average observer, but it was there, a fracture just beneath the surface, a hesitation that wasn't rooted in nerves but something deeper. And then she moved. It was slight, almost imperceptible. A shift in posture, the faintest motion of her hand, so subtle that most would dismiss it as nothing more than an unconscious gesture. But it wasn't. It was deliberate. A fraction of a second later, an unexpected stillness swept over the room. The atmosphere, once filled with the routine sounds of the courtroom, the turning of pages, the soft scratching of pens against paper, seemed to still as if something unseen had taken hold. The witness faltered, a momentary flicker of uncertainty, crossing their face. The confidence in their voice wavered, barely noticeable to those who weren't listening closely. A slight intake of breath, a shift in their seat. Their hands, which had been resting steadily before them, tensed ever so slightly. Pam Bondi's expression remained unchanged. Her eyes held steady, focused, unwavering. She wasn't pressing, wasn't making any outward attempt to force the moment. But something had changed. The judge, a figure known for maintaining firm control over the courtroom, paused ever so slightly. It wasn't a dramatic interruption, wasn't a sudden break in protocol, but it was a hesitation, one that signaled something out of the ordinary had just taken place. A glance was cast, one that held a silent question. The opposing counsel stiffened. They had been following the testimony carefully, confident in the witness's ability to deliver a statement that would strengthen their case. But now, a seed of doubt had been planted. It wasn't loud, wasn't spoken into existence, but it was there, growing with each passing second. A moment stretched into something heavier, something far more significant than it appeared on the surface. The courtroom, a place built on structure and order, now carried an energy that was anything but routine. The shift was unspoken, yet undeniable. Something had happened, something only a few truly understood. The courtroom had settled into an uneasy silence, the kind that preceded something unexpected. The witness in the stand was visibly tense now, shifting in their seat as though suddenly aware of the weight of their own words. Moments earlier, they had spoken with confidence, delivering each statement with conviction. Now, something was different. It wasn't a dramatic change, not something obvious enough for the average observer to immediately notice, but it was there, a fracture in their composure, a hesitation that hadn't existed before. Pam Bondi sat motionless, her expression unreadable. She had been listening carefully, not just to the words but to everything unspoken. The slight inflections, the pacing of the responses, the choice of words, every detail mattered. It wasn't just about the facts presented, it was about how they were presented. And something about this testimony wasn't adding up. A few members of the jury shifted in their seats. They too had sensed something was off, even if they couldn't quite place what it was. A witness's body language often spoke louder than their words, and this one was suddenly betraying more than they intended. The tension in their shoulders, the stiffness of their posture, the way their fingers curled slightly inward, all signs of discomfort, of a subtle internal battle. Across the room, the opposing counsel remained still, but there was an undeniable shift in their demeanor. A few minutes ago, they had been at ease, confident that this testimony would serve as a cornerstone of their case. Now they were watching more intently, their gaze narrowing ever so slightly. The judge cleared their throat, prepared to move things along, but the moment had already taken on a life of its own. It was as if the very air had thickened, as though an invisible force had settled over the room, demanding attention. The witness swallowed hard, their throat bobbing slightly, and glanced toward the prosecution's table as if searching for reassurance. But none came. Pam Bondi leaned forward slightly, just enough to signal that she was still completely engaged, but not enough to break the calm authority she carried. There was no need to rush, no need to force anything. The truth had a way of surfacing on its own when the right pressure was applied, and right now that pressure was working its way through the cracks of the carefully crafted testimony. Anubi, witnesses' breathing had changed, shallow now, controlled in a way that suggested they were fighting to maintain composure. The questions continued, probing deeper, and each answer seemed just a fraction more hesitant than the last. Each moment that passed chipped away at the confidence that had been so strong when they first took the stand. The jury was paying closer attention now. It was subtle, but their eyes were fixed on the witness in a way they hadn't been before. They were no longer just hearing words. They were evaluating them, questioning them, doubting them. The opposing counsel finally shifted, the first real movement they had made in several minutes. A hand reached for a pen, tapping it lightly against the table, a nervous habit that betrayed their growing concern. They knew, just as well as anyone who had been watching closely, that something had just changed in this trial. Pam Bondi remained poised, unwavering, letting the weight of the moment settle over the room. She knew better than to rush it. Sometimes, silence was the most powerful tool in a courtroom. It forced people to sit with the truth, to feel the weight of their own words. And right now, that weight was pressing down hard on the person in the witness stand. The air in the courtroom had grown heavier, charged with an energy that hadn't been there moments before. It wasn't just the words being spoken, it was everything between them, the silences, the shifting postures, the way people were suddenly far more aware of each other. Something had shifted, and everyone felt it. Pam Bondi remained seated, perfectly composed, as if the unraveling before her had been anticipated all along. She was patient, watching the witness, watching the jury, watching the way the opposing counsel was now gripping their pen just a little too tightly. She had seen this before, the moment when confidence gave way to uncertainty, when a carefully crafted story started to crack under the weight of its own inconsistencies. The judge was silent now, not rushing forward but clearly considering something. This was no longer routine. There had been a rhythm to the proceedings before, a back and forth between both sides, a structured dance that played out in courtrooms across the country. But now, something had disrupted that balance. The witness, who had started the day with Baopuai, such certainty, was visibly struggling to maintain composure. Their eyes darted momentarily to the side, looking for an anchor, a moment of reassurance, but there was none to be found. Each answer they gave was now met with greater scrutiny, their hesitations more pronounced. The weight of their words was shifting, no longer a force in their favor but something pressing down on them, demanding more than they were willing or able to provide. Pam Bondi let the silence stretch. In that silence, everything became louder, the quiet rustling of papers, the steady ticking of the clock, the occasional intake of breath. In that silence, doubt settled in, wrapping itself around the case like a slow-moving fog. The jury was watching intently now, eyes narrowing slightly, lips pressing into thin lines. Some leaned forward, their focus no longer passive but completely locked in. They weren't just hearing what was being said, they were evaluating it, measuring every hesitation, every shift in tone, every subtle inconsistency. The opposing counsel finally moved, leaning in slightly as if trying to regain control of the moment. They had been confident before, certain that the foundation they had built would hold. But now, cracks were appearing, and the longer this silence stretched, the wider those cracks became. Pam Bondi didn't rush to fill the space. She had been in too many courtrooms, had seen too many people try to force their way through uncertainty with aggression or bluster. That wasn't necessary. Truth had a way of surfacing on its own when the right amount of pressure was applied. The judge finally spoke, their voice measured but carrying a weight of its own. The question that followed was simple, but it cut through the tension like a knife. It wasn't asked out of routine. It was asked because something demanded further explanation. The witness blinked, exhaling slowly, their hands tightening into fists before releasing. Their answer came after a pause, the hesitation now impossible to ignore. The room held its breath. Across the gallery, reporters scribbled furiously, sensing a shift in the case that could redefine its entire trajectory. Cameras clicked, pens scratched against paper, and the weight of the moment grew heavier still. Pam Bondi remained where she was, unmoving, watching as the case turned in real time. She didn't need to speak to make her presence known. The truth was already working its way to the surface, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it now. The courtroom was no longer the same as it had been at the start of the day. The witness, once steady and composed, had unraveled before everyone's eyes. The jury had shifted from passive listeners to active observers, their expressions no longer neutral but thoughtful, calculating. The opposing counsel, who had once been so sure of their case, now sat in rigid silence, aware that the tide had turned in a way that could not be undone. Pam Bondi remained steady, her expression unreadable, but undeniably in control. She had seen this moment coming long before anyone else had. She had waited for it, knowing that truth has a way of surfacing when the right conditions are set, and now it had arrived in full force, undeniable and irreversible. The judge's voice cut through the room, calling for order, but there was no chaos to settle, just the heavy realization that the case had shifted in a way that no one had expected. The silence was louder than words, each person in the courtroom processing what had just unfolded. The reporters in the gallery exchanged glances, some furiously jotting down notes while others simply sat back, absorbing the weight of what had transpired. The witness exhaled slowly, their shoulders sagging slightly, as if they too had recognized that the inevitable had happened. Their words, once so carefully chosen, had been measured, dissected, and ultimately exposed for what they truly were. Pam Bondi finally moved, gathering her papers with the same deliberate composure she had maintained throughout the entire trial. She didn't need to gloat, didn't need to press any further. The work had been done, the case had spoken for itself. Justice wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was found in the quiet unraveling of a lie, in the slow but certain shift of doubt into clarity. The judge gave a final nod, signaling the conclusion of the day's proceedings. The sound of chairs shifting, of whispered conversations, beginning to ripple through the room, filled the space as people prepared to leave. But the weight of what had happened remained, lingering in the air like an unspoken truth that no one could ignore. As she stood, she allowed herself one last glance at the jury, at the opposing counsel, at the witness who now sat in stunned silence. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away, leaving behind a courtroom that would never forget what had